The scream came from the courtyard before the sun had even finished rising, and every servant in Ashcombe Manor froze where they stood. Eli Whitfield was 11 years old, and he had never heard a grown man cry out like that before. He dropped the bucket of water he was carrying and ran toward the sound, his bare feet slapping against the cold stone path. What he saw when he rounded the corner of the stable would stay with him for the rest of his life, though at that moment he did not yet understand why. A carriage stood in the courtyard, its black paint gleaming under the pale morning light. The horses were still, too still, their eyes wide and their nostrils flaring as if they, too, sensed something wrong. And standing beside the open carriage door was Duke Edmund Ashcombe, one hand pressed against the frame, staring down at something on the ground that Eli could not yet see. This was the world Eli and his mother had entered only 3 weeks earlier, and already it felt like a place built on secrets. Grace Whitfield had brought her son to Ashcombe Manor after losing her position at a smaller estate 2 counties away, following the sudden death of her previous employer. She was a quiet, steady woman who had raised Eli alone since his father passed when the boy was only 4. She did not speak much about the past, and Eli had learned not to ask. What mattered now was the work in front of them, and the roof over their heads, and the promise of steady wages that came with a position at one of the largest estates in the region. When they first arrived, Ashcombe Manor seemed like something out of a storybook. The main house rose 3 stories high, built from pale gray stone that seemed to glow gold at sunset. Ivy climbed one entire wing of the building, and gardens stretched out behind it in neat geometric patterns that a small army of gardeners tended every day. Eli had never seen anything so grand, and for the first few days he simply wandered the grounds with his mouth slightly open, trying to take it all in. But grandeur, he would soon learn, does not always mean happiness. The Duke himself was a tall, serious man in his early 40s, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples and eyes that seemed to carry a weight far heavier than his title. He rarely smiled. He rarely spoke to the staff beyond what was necessary. And though the manor was filled with fine furniture and expensive paintings and rooms that Eli could not begin to count, there was a stillness to the place that unsettled him from the very first night. He asked his mother about it on their second evening, as she tucked a thin blanket around his shoulders in the small room they shared above the kitchens. "Why is everyone so quiet here, Mum? Nobody laughs. Nobody sings while they work like they did at the old house." Grace was quiet for a long moment before she answered. "Some houses carry grief the way people do, Eli. You'll learn to feel it if you stay long enough. Best not to ask too many questions until you understand the shape of a place." Eli did not fully understand what she meant, not then. But over the following days, he began to piece together fragments of the story from things he overheard in the kitchen, in the laundry room, in the stables where he liked to spend his afternoons. 2 years earlier, the Duke's wife, Duchess Eleanor Ashcombe, had died. The official explanation given to the staff and to the public was that she had suffered a sudden illness of the heart, one that struck without warning and took her within a single night. She had been buried in the family plot at the edge of the estate, beneath a white stone angel that Eli had seen once from a distance, standing watch over the grave like a silent guardian. But not everyone believed the official story. Eli first heard the whispers from 2 laundry maids, a pair of sisters named Alice and Margaret, who did not know he was close enough to hear them as they folded linens near the open window of the wash house. He had been sitting just outside, mending a torn strap on his boot, and their voices carried easily on the still afternoon air. "She wasn't sick a day in her life before that night," Alice said, her voice low. "I dressed her hair every morning for 3 years. A woman doesn't hide a weak heart from someone who sees her that close, that often." "Then what do you think happened?" Margaret asked. "I think somebody wanted her gone. I think somebody got what they wanted, and the Duke has been drowning in his own house ever since, too broken to see what was right in front of him." Eli sat very still, his fingers frozen on the leather strap, and listened as the 2 women continued their work in silence after that, as if even they were frightened by what had just been said aloud. That night he lay awake long after his mother had fallen asleep beside him, staring up at the low wooden ceiling of their small room, turning the words over and over in his mind. Somebody wanted her gone. It was the kind of sentence a boy his age should not have to think about, and yet he could not stop himself. Over the following days, Eli began to watch the manor more closely than he ever had before. He was a naturally observant child, the kind who noticed when a servant's hands trembled slightly while pouring tea, or when a conversation stopped the moment he walked into a room. His mother often said he had his father's eyes, sharp and searching, always looking for the piece of a puzzle that did not quite fit. And it did not take him long to notice the carriage. It was unlike any other vehicle that came and went from Ashcombe Manor. The estate had several carriages of its own, all bearing the Ashcombe family crest, a silver hawk against a field of deep blue painted proudly on each door. Visitors arrived in carriages of their own design, some plain, some ornate, each one distinct in its own way. But this particular carriage carried no crest at all. Its black paint was smooth and unmarked, its curtains always drawn tightly shut, and Eli never once saw the face of the man who drove it. The first time he noticed it, he was helping one of the stable hands, a friendly young man named Walter who had taken a liking to Eli during his very first week at the manor. Walter taught him how to brush down the horses properly, how to check their hooves for stones, how to speak to them softly so they would trust him. It was during one of these lessons that the unmarked carriage rolled quietly through the estate gates and came to a stop near the side entrance of the house, far from the main courtyard where visitors usually arrived. "Who's that then?" Eli asked, watching as the driver, hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a heavy coat despite the mild weather, climbed down and disappeared through the side door without a word to anyone. Walter glanced over and Eli noticed something shift in his expression, a flicker of unease quickly smoothed away. "Not sure, lad. Comes and goes every so often. Best not to worry yourself over it. Grand houses like this one have all sorts of business we're not meant to understand." But Eli did worry over it. He could not help himself. Over the following 2 weeks, he began to notice the carriage returning again and again, always at strange hours, always avoiding the main courtyard, always leaving before anyone could get a clear look at the driver's face. Sometimes it arrived just after midnight, when Eli happened to be awake and looking out the small window of his room. Sometimes it came in the gray hour just before dawn, slipping away again before the household had even begun to stir. He started keeping track. It began almost as a game, the kind of secret project a lonely child invents to make sense of an unfamiliar world. He found a small notebook, its pages worn and half empty, left behind in a drawer in the room he shared with his mother, and he began writing down the dates and times whenever he spotted the strange carriage. He wrote in a careful hand, the way his mother had taught him, forming each letter slowly so it would be legible even to himself weeks later. He did not fully understand why he was doing it. He only knew that something about the carriage felt wrong, the way a held breath feels wrong, the way silence feels wrong in a room that should be filled with sound. One evening, unable to keep the secret to himself any longer, Eli found his mother in the small sitting room off the kitchen, mending a torn apron by candlelight after the rest of the household had gone to bed. He sat down beside her and told her everything. The carriage, the driver whose face he had never seen, the strange hours it came and went, the notebook he had been keeping hidden beneath his mattress. Grace listened patiently, her needle pausing occasionally as she took in his words, but when he finished, she simply shook her head and reached out to smooth his hair back from his forehead. "Eli, my love, you have too much imagination for your own good, just like your father did. This is a grand estate with a great many visitors and a great deal of business we are not meant to understand. Not every strange thing is a mystery waiting to be solved. Some things are simply none of our concern." "But Mum," the maid said. "I know what the maid said. Servants love to talk, Eli, especially about things they don't understand. Grief makes people invent stories to explain what feels senseless. The Duchess passed from illness, and that is a sad thing, but it is not a secret. Now, off to bed with you. Morning comes early in this house. Eli did not argue further, but he did not stop watching either. He simply learned to keep his observations to himself, filling the pages of his small notebook in private, in the quiet hours when his mother believed him to be asleep. He noticed other things too in those early weeks. He noticed that the Duke often retreated to his study late at night and did not emerge until well past midnight, the candlelight beneath his door the only sign that he was still awake at all. He noticed that a particular guest visited more often than any other, a well-dressed man with a thin mustache and a voice that was always pleasant, always smooth, always somehow slightly too careful. The staff referred to him as Lord Pembroke, and Eli learned that he was the late Duchess's cousin, a relation who had grown remarkably close to the Duke's affairs since her passing. Lord Pembroke had a way of speaking to the servants that made Eli's skin prickle, though he could not have said exactly why. He was never unkind, never harsh, and yet there was something calculating behind his easy smile, something that reminded Eli of a man counting coins behind his back even as he shook your hand with the other. It was Lord Pembroke, Eli soon learned, who had arranged for the Duke's carriage service to the capital, where the Duke traveled several times a year to attend to matters of business and government. It was Lord Pembroke who managed a great deal of the estate's finances since the Duchess's death, a burden the grieving Duke had been only too willing to hand over to a trusted family member. And it was Lord Pembroke, Eli began to suspect, who might have some connection to the strange, unmarked carriage that visited the manor in the darkest hours of the night. He had no proof of this. He had only a feeling, the kind of feeling that settles low in a child's stomach and refuses to leave no matter how many times he tries to reason it away. 3 weeks into their new life at Ashcombe Manor, Eli overheard something that turned his quiet suspicion into something closer to fear. He had been sent to the stable loft to fetch a bundle of clean straw for the horses' stalls, a simple errand he had done a dozen times before. The loft was a narrow space above the stables, reached by a rickety wooden ladder, and it was there, tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the far wall, that Eli discovered something he was never meant to find. It was a small leather ledger, its cover worn soft with age, hidden so carefully that Eli might never have noticed it at all if he had not stumbled and caught himself against that very section of flooring, feeling the board shift beneath his foot in a way that solid wood should not. He should have left it alone. He knew that, even as his small fingers pried the board free and lifted the ledger into the dim light filtering through the loft's single window. But curiosity has always been stronger than caution in children who have learned to notice what others overlook, and Eli was no exception. The ledger was filled with columns of numbers, dates, and names he did not fully recognize, written in a hand that was not the Duke's neat, formal script but something rougher, more hurried, as if the writer had been working quickly and did not wish to be discovered. Eli could not understand most of what he saw. He was only 11, and though his mother had taught him to read and write and do simple sums, the language of business and finance was still a mystery to him. But one thing he did understand, because it appeared again and again throughout the pages, was a small symbol drawn at the bottom of certain entries, a curved line crossing through a circle, like a crescent moon cutting across a full one. He had never seen anything like it before, and yet something about it tugged at his memory. It was only later that evening, as he lay in bed turning the strange symbol over in his mind, that he remembered where he had seen it. Carved, faintly but unmistakably, into the wooden door of the unmarked black carriage, so small that a person would need to be standing right beside it to notice at all. His heart began to pound. He told himself it was nothing, a coincidence, the kind of thing an overactive imagination invents when it wants a story to be true. But the feeling would not leave him, and for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Manor, Eli Whitfield understood that he had wandered into something far larger and far more dangerous than he had ever intended. He returned the ledger to its hiding place beneath the loose floorboard exactly as he had found it, careful to leave no trace of his discovery. But he could not put the memory of it out of his mind. Over the following days, he found himself watching the manor with new eyes, no longer simply curious but genuinely afraid, though he could not have said exactly what he feared. He thought of telling his mother again, but he remembered the way she had dismissed his earlier concerns, and he did not wish to be told once more that he had too much imagination. He thought of telling Walter, but the stable hand's uneasy reaction to the carriage suggested that even he did not wish to know more than he already did. So Eli kept his discovery to himself, adding a small, careful drawing of the strange symbol to the back pages of his notebook, alongside his growing record of dates and times. He did not know what he was building toward. He only knew that some quiet, insistent part of him refused to let the matter rest, the same part of him that had once made his mother call him too much like his father, a man who had never been able to leave a puzzle unsolved. Little did he know that the pieces he was gathering, one by one, in the quiet hours when the rest of the house slept, would one day mean the difference between life and something far darker for the very man who had barely spoken a word to him since his arrival. The days at Ashcombe Manor continued to pass in their careful, quiet rhythm, the household moving through its routines with the practiced ease of people who had long ago learned not to ask too many questions. But beneath that calm surface, Eli sensed something building slowly, steadily, like storm clouds gathering just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to break. He did not yet know how close that moment truly was. Autumn settled over Ashcombe Manor slowly that year, turning the gardens gold and copper, scattering leaves across the long gravel drive that Eli had grown to know so well. He had been at the estate for nearly 2 months now, and though the manor still felt like a place holding its breath, he had begun to find small pockets of comfort within it. The stables had become his favorite refuge, a place where the horses did not care about titles or secrets, where Walter's easy laughter offered a welcome contrast to the careful silence of the main house. Walter Higgins was 17, tall and lean, with sandy hair that always seemed to fall across his forehead, no matter how many times he pushed it back. He had worked at Ashcombe Manor since he was 13, starting as little more than a stable boy himself, and he had a patience with Eli that few of the other adults on the estate seemed to possess. He answered Eli's endless questions without complaint, showed him how to braid a horse's mane, how to tell when a storm was coming by the way the animals grew restless, how to move quietly enough that even the most skittish mare would not startle at his approach. It was during one of these long afternoons in the stable that Eli finally worked up the courage to ask Walter directly about the things he had overheard. "Walter," he said, brushing down the flank of a gentle bay mare named Clover, "do you think the Duchess really died of a sick heart?" Walter's hands stilled on the bridle he had been cleaning. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and Eli wondered if he had asked something forbidden, something that would earn him the same gentle dismissal his mother had offered weeks before. But when Walter finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its usual easy humor. "I don't know what to think, truth be told. I was here that night, you know. Not in the house, but close enough to hear the commotion when it happened. There was a great deal of shouting and then a terrible quiet, and by morning the doctor had come and gone and everyone was told it was her heart." He paused, running his thumb along a worn strap of leather. "But I'll tell you this much, lad. The Duchess used to come down to these very stables most mornings before the sun was even properly up, just to visit the horses. She loved them the way you do. And a woman who can walk that far, that early, day after day, doesn't strike me as someone carrying a weak heart." Eli's breath caught in his chest. "Then what happened to her?" Walter shook his head slowly. "That's not a question a stable hand is meant to ask, and it's certainly not one you should go around asking either. Some things in a house like this are better left buried, Eli. For your own safety as much as anyone else's." The warning in Walter's voice was unmistakable, and it did more to fuel Eli's curiosity than any amount of gossip ever could have. He said nothing more on the subject that afternoon, but that night, by the thin light of a stub of candle he had saved from the kitchen, he added new lines to his notebook, recording everything Walter had told him in his careful, deliberate hand. Over the following weeks, Eli's understanding of the manor's rhythms deepened. He learned that Lord Pembroke visited nearly every Tuesday and Friday, always arriving in his own respectable carriage bearing a modest family crest, always spending long hours closeted with the Duke in the study that overlooked the eastern gardens. He learned that the unmarked black carriage, the one with the strange crescent symbol carved into its door, never arrived on those same days, as though its schedule had been deliberately arranged to avoid overlapping with Lord Pembroke's visits. This observation struck Eli as significant, though he could not yet say exactly why. He began to wonder whether Lord Pembroke knew about the mysterious carriage at all, or whether its comings and goings were a secret kept even from him. He also began to pay closer attention to the Duke himself, watching him from a careful distance the way he might watch a wounded animal, curious but wary of getting too close. Duke Edmund Ashcombe was not a cruel man, Eli decided after weeks of quiet observation. He was simply a man who had folded in on himself, the way a flower closes its petals against the cold. He ate his meals alone in the great dining hall, though the table could easily have seated 20. He walked the gardens in the evenings with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the hedges and flower beds, somewhere Eli suspected only the Duke himself could see. One evening, as Eli carried a basket of freshly cut herbs from the kitchen garden toward the house, he nearly collided with the Duke himself, who had been walking the same path in the opposite direction, lost in thought. "Careful there," the Duke said, steadying Eli's shoulder with one hand before he could stumble and spill the basket's contents across the gravel path. "Sorry, sir, my lord." "I mean," Eli fumbled over the correct title, his cheeks warming with embarrassment. But to his surprise, the corner of the Duke's mouth twitched upward, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Eli's nerves eased slightly. "Your Grace will do, though I confess I've never much cared for the formality of it. You're the housekeeper's son, aren't you? Whitfield, I believe." "Yes, Your Grace, Eli." "Eli," the Duke repeated the name as though testing its weight. "You've settled in well, I hope. Life on a large estate can be overwhelming for a child, especially one who has recently lost so much familiarity all at once." Eli was surprised that the Duke had noticed anything about him at all, let alone spoken so directly about the upheaval of his recent life. "I like the horses best, Your Grace. Walter's been teaching me." "Walter is a good lad, reliable. My late wife was fond of him too." A shadow passed briefly across the Duke's face at the mention of the Duchess, there, and gone so quickly that Eli might have imagined it had he not been watching so closely. "She loved those stables more than any room in this house, I think. Strange, the things we remember about the people we've lost." The Duke seemed to catch himself then, as though he had said more than he intended to a child he barely knew, and he straightened, the brief warmth in his expression retreating behind the same careful distance Eli had come to expect from him. "Run along now, before your herbs wilt and the cook has both our heads for it." Eli hurried on his way, but the brief exchange stayed with him for days afterward. He found himself thinking not just of the mysteries surrounding the Duchess's death, but of the Duke himself, a man clearly still carrying an enormous weight of grief, a man who, despite his title and his fortune, seemed profoundly alone in the world. It was around this time that Eli began noticing something new. The unmarked carriage was not the only irregular presence at Ashcombe Manor. He started paying attention to letters as well, watching as the post arrived each morning, and was sorted by one of the senior footmen before being delivered to the appropriate members of the household. Most letters bore the seals of familiar correspondents, business associates, distant relatives, acquaintances from the Duke's circle in the capital. But every so often, a letter arrived bearing no seal at all, wrapped in plain paper, addressed in a hand Eli did not recognize, and delivered not through the usual post but by a rider who came and went so quickly that most of the household never even noticed his arrival. These plain, unmarked letters were always taken directly to Lord Pembroke's study when he was in residence, or held for him until his next visit if he was not. Eli noted each occurrence carefully in his notebook, building a growing record of dates, times, and small details that, taken individually, meant very little, but which he sensed might mean a great deal more when considered together. He shared none of this with his mother, who remained convinced that her son's imagination was simply working overtime in an unfamiliar environment. Grace Whitfield had enough to occupy her own attention, managing the daily operations of a household staffed by nearly 30 servants, and she had little patience left over for what she considered her son's fanciful theories. "You'll wear yourself thin chasing shadows, Eli," she told him one evening, noticing the dark circles beginning to form beneath his eyes from too many late nights spent awake, watching the courtyard from their small window. "This is a house of grief, not a house of villains. Sometimes sadness is simply sadness, without any hidden explanation beneath it." Eli wanted to believe her. Some nights, exhausted from his secret vigils, he almost did. But then the black carriage would return, sliding silently through the estate gates under cover of darkness, and his doubts would flare up all over again, refusing to be extinguished no matter how tired he became. It was Walter who finally gave him the piece of information that changed everything. Nearly 6 weeks after Eli's arrival at Ashcombe Manor, he was helping Walter repair a section of fencing near the eastern pasture when the older boy mentioned, almost as an aside, that the Duke would soon be traveling to the capital for an extended stay, to attend to matters before the opening of the winter parliamentary session. "Happens every year around this time," Walter explained, hammering a nail into place with practiced ease. "He'll be gone the better part of a month, sometimes longer. Lord Pembroke usually arranges the whole affair, the carriage, the travel schedule, everything. The Duke's never been one for handling those details himself, not since—" Walter stopped himself, glancing sideways at Eli. "Not since the Duchess died," Eli finished quietly. Walter nodded, his expression grave. "She used to manage all of that, kept the household running like clockwork, she did. Since she passed, the Duke's handed most of it over to Lord Pembroke, trusts him completely from what I understand. Family, after all." Eli's mind immediately returned to the strange ledger hidden in the stable loft, to the unmarked letters, to the black carriage with its crescent symbol that never overlapped with Lord Pembroke's scheduled visits. A cold, uneasy feeling settled in his stomach, one he could not quite name but which felt uncomfortably close to fear. "When does he leave? The Duke, I mean, for the capital?" Walter shrugged, testing the fence post to make sure it stood firm. "Don't know the exact date. Soon, though, from what I've heard below stairs. There's already been talk of preparing his traveling trunks." That night Eli lay awake long after his mother had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep beside him, staring up at the familiar shadows on the ceiling, turning every fragment of information over in his mind like pieces of a puzzle he did not yet have enough evidence to complete. He thought of the ledger's strange columns of numbers. He thought of the crescent symbol carved so carefully, so deliberately, into the door of a carriage that came and went like a shadow, always avoiding the light. He thought of the Duke's quiet grief, and Lord Pembroke's careful, calculating smile, and the unmarked letters that traveled by secret rider straight to Pembroke's study. Something was going to happen, he was certain of it now. Some final piece of whatever quiet scheme had been unfolding beneath the surface of Ashcombe Manor for longer than Eli had even been alive on the estate. And it was going to happen soon, tied somehow to the Duke's departure for the capital. He did not know what to do with this certainty. He was 11 years old, the son of a housekeeper, with no proof beyond a hidden ledger he had discovered by accident and a series of careful observations recorded in a worn notebook that no adult in his life took seriously. Who would believe him? Who would even listen? But as the days passed and the household began the visible preparations for the Duke's journey, trunks being packed, travel documents being gathered, the household staff moving with a new sense of purpose and urgency, Eli found himself watching the unmarked carriage's pattern of visits with growing, desperate attention. And then, one crisp morning 9 days before the Duke's scheduled departure, Eli noticed something that made his blood run cold. The unmarked black carriage arrived at the estate gates just after dawn, exactly as it had done many times before. But this time, instead of slipping away toward the side entrance as it usually did, it circled the courtyard once, slowly, deliberately, as though its unseen occupant were studying the grand front entrance of the house itself, measuring distances, calculating angles, committing details to memory. Eli watched from behind the low garden wall where he had been crouched, gathering fallen chestnuts for the kitchen, his heart hammering against his ribs as the carriage completed its silent circuit and rolled away without ever stopping at all. It was, he understood with sudden, terrible clarity, a rehearsal. Whatever was coming, whatever quiet, patient scheme had been unfolding in the shadows of Ashcombe Manor for months, perhaps years, it was drawing very close to its conclusion now. And unless someone intervened, unless someone found a way to stop it, Eli feared that the Duke himself might be the one who paid the price. He spent that entire day in a state of near panic, torn between his fear of not being believed and his growing certainty that silence was no longer an option. By evening, he had made up his mind. He would tell his mother everything, every detail he had gathered, every fear he had been carrying alone, and this time he would not let her dismiss him so easily. But when he found her that night, exhausted from a long day overseeing preparations for the Duke's journey, something in her weary expression made him hesitate. She looked so tired, so burdened already by the demands of her new position, that he could not bring himself to add the weight of his fears onto her shoulders as well, not without something more solid to offer than a boy's uneasy feelings and a stack of careful notes she had already dismissed once before. Instead, he made a different decision, one that would set the final events of that terrible, extraordinary autumn into motion. He decided that if no one else would investigate what he had discovered, he would simply have to gather enough proof himself, proof so undeniable that even the most skeptical adult could not turn away from it. He did not yet know how dangerous that decision would prove to be, nor how little time remained before the Duke would step, unknowingly, toward a carriage that had been waiting for him for far longer than anyone at Ashcombe Manor could have imagined. Eli began his quiet investigation the very next morning, though he was careful never to call it that, not even in the privacy of his own thoughts. He told himself he was simply being watchful, the way his mother had always taught him to be watchful of strangers and unfamiliar roads, but deep down, he knew he had crossed into something far more deliberate than simple caution. His first task was to return to the stable loft, to the hidden ledger he had discovered weeks earlier, and to study it more carefully than he had dared to before. He waited for an afternoon when Walter had been sent on an errand to the far side of the estate, giving Eli the rare gift of complete privacy in the stables. He climbed the rickety ladder with his heart pounding, pried up the loose floorboard, and lifted the worn leather ledger into the dim light once more. This time, he did not simply glance at the pages before returning them to their hiding place. He sat cross-legged on the rough wooden floor of the loft, the ledger open across his knees, and forced himself to study each entry slowly, sounding out unfamiliar words under his breath, the way his mother had taught him when he first learned to read. Much of it remained beyond his understanding. The columns of numbers meant little to a boy who had only just mastered simple sums, and many of the terms scrawled across the pages, references to accounts, drafts, and transfers, were entirely foreign to him. But certain patterns began to emerge even through his limited understanding, patterns that made the uneasy feeling in his stomach grow steadily heavier. He noticed that a name appeared again and again throughout the ledger's pages, Ashcombe Trust. Beside this name, sums of money were recorded, sometimes small, sometimes shockingly large, always followed by a second notation indicating that the funds had been transferred to an account bearing a different name entirely, one Eli did not recognize at all. He counted at least a dozen such transfers across the pages he examined, each one dated over the past 2 years, each one growing slightly larger than the last, as though whoever was responsible had grown bolder with time, more confident that no one was watching closely enough to notice. Near the back of the ledger, tucked between 2 pages that seemed to have been added more recently than the rest, judging by the crispness of the paper compared to the yellowed pages surrounding them, Eli found something that made his breath catch entirely. It was a rough sketch, hastily drawn, depicting what appeared to be the front courtyard of Ashcombe Manor itself, complete with small markings indicating the position of the main entrance, the fountain at its center, and a curved line tracing a path from the estate gates to the front steps of the house. Beside this sketch, in the same hurried handwriting that filled the rest of the ledger, were several notes that Eli struggled to fully decipher, though certain words leaped out at him with terrible clarity. Departure, 13th, confirmed, final payment. He did not need to understand every word to grasp the shape of what he was looking at. Someone had been planning something involving the Duke's departure, someone who had access to detailed information about the household schedule, someone who had been paid and would continue to be paid for whatever role they were meant to play. His hands trembling slightly, Eli turned back to the very front of the ledger, searching for anything that might reveal exactly who had been keeping these careful, damning records. He found nothing so direct as a signature or a name declaring ownership. But tucked into the inside cover, nearly hidden by the worn leather binding itself, he found a small folded piece of paper that had clearly been placed there deliberately, meant to be kept safe and separate from the rest. He unfolded it carefully, his fingers clumsy with urgency, and found himself looking at what appeared to be a letter, written in a far more polished, formal hand than the rest of the ledger's hurried entries. It began without any greeting at all, as though the writer had wished to leave no trace of who the intended recipient might be. The arrangements proceed as discussed. The physician has been compensated adequately for his discretion regarding the events of that night, and I am confident his silence will hold indefinitely, given what he stands to lose should the truth of his negligence ever come to light. The staff suspect nothing beyond ordinary grief. As for the matter of the estate's future management, I trust that patience will yield the results we both desire, though I confess the wait has tested my resolve more than once. We are close now to securing what should have been mine from the beginning, had circumstances been arranged more favorably from the start. There was no signature at the bottom of the letter, no name to confirm who had written it or to whom it had been addressed. But Eli did not need a signature to understand the terrible weight of what he had just read. The physician has been compensated adequately for his discretion regarding the events of that night. The words seemed to burn themselves into his memory, and he understood, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in his chest, that the Duchess's death had not been the simple tragedy the household had been told to believe. He folded the letter carefully, exactly as he had found it, and returned it to its hiding place inside the ledger's cover before sliding the entire book back beneath the loose floorboard, arranging the straw above it exactly as it had been before. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him 3 attempts to press the floorboard back into place. He climbed down from the loft on unsteady legs, his mind racing far ahead of his understanding, trying and failing to organize the terrible pieces of information into something he could actually act upon. Someone, likely Lord Pembroke, given his access to the estate's finances and his clear ambitions regarding its management, had been involved in the Duchess's death, or at the very least had paid to ensure that the truth of it never came to light. And now, with the Duke's departure for the capital approaching, that same person appeared to be planning something involving the front courtyard of the manor itself. Eli spent the following days in a state of quiet, constant vigilance, watching every detail of the household's preparations with new and desperate attention. He noticed that Lord Pembroke's visits had grown more frequent as the date of the Duke's departure approached, his conversations with the Duke growing longer, more private, conducted always behind the closed door of the study, with instructions that no servant was to disturb them. He noticed, too, that the household staff had begun making arrangements for a new carriage service to handle the Duke's journey to the capital, one that Lord Pembroke had personally recommended and arranged, replacing the estate's usual travel arrangements with what he described to the housekeeper's staff as a more discreet and efficient service, better suited to the Duke's need for privacy during such a difficult season of grief. Eli overheard this explanation while helping his mother prepare an inventory of linens for the Duke's traveling trunks, and the moment the words left the head footman's mouth, a chill ran down his spine so sharp that he nearly dropped the stack of folded sheets he had been carrying. A more discreet and efficient service. He thought immediately of the unmarked black carriage with its crescent symbol, the one that had circled the courtyard so deliberately just days before, as though measuring the distance and angles of an approach it intended to make again, under very different circumstances. That evening, unable to contain his fear any longer, Eli sought out Walter in the stables, finding him mucking out one of the far stalls by lantern light, the horses shifting restlessly around him in the gathering darkness. "Walter," Eli said, his voice low and urgent, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually listen, not just tell me I'm imagining things." Something in the boy's tone must have caught Walter's attention, because he set down his shovel and turned to face Eli fully, his expression growing serious. "All right. I'm listening." Eli told him everything then, the ledger, the hidden letter, the crescent symbol that matched the carving on the unmarked carriage, the strange rehearsal circuit it had made through the courtyard, the new travel arrangements Lord Pembroke had personally recommended for the Duke's upcoming journey. He spoke quickly, breathlessly, watching Walter's face for any sign of the dismissal he had grown so used to receiving from his mother. But Walter did not dismiss him. Instead, as Eli spoke, the older boy's expression grew steadily more troubled, until by the time Eli finished, he was staring at him with an intensity that made the younger boy's stomach twist with a mixture of relief and renewed fear. "You actually read this ledger yourself, with your own eyes?" "Yes. Twice now. It's hidden beneath a loose board in the loft, right where you and I have stood 100 times. Walter ran a hand through his sandy hair, exhaling slowly. "Eli, if even half of what you're describing is true, this isn't something either of us can handle on our own. This is the kind of thing that needs to go to someone with real authority, someone who can actually do something about it." "Who? My mother won't listen. She thinks I'm imagining things just like you did at first. And I can hardly walk up to the Duke himself and tell him his own cousin might have had something to do with his wife's death, based on a ledger I found by accident in a stable loft." Walter was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the same helpless frustration that had been building in Eli for weeks. Finally, he spoke, his voice careful and deliberate. "Then we need proof stronger than a hidden ledger and a boy's suspicions. We need something undeniable, something that can't be explained away or dismissed." "How do we get that?" "I don't know yet, but we have time before the Duke's departure, don't we? A week, perhaps more." Eli nodded, though the certainty he had felt just days before was already beginning to waver under the weight of Walter's caution. 9 days when I last checked, maybe fewer now." "Then we watch. Carefully, quietly, and together this time, so you're not carrying the weight of this alone. And if we find anything more, anything solid enough to bring before someone who can actually act on it, we bring it to the Duke's personal physician or to the estate's solicitor. Someone outside of Lord Pembroke's influence, someone who cannot simply be dismissed." It was, Eli realized, the first time since his arrival at Ashcombe Manor that another person had truly believed him, had taken his fears seriously enough to offer a real plan rather than gentle dismissal. The relief of it was almost overwhelming, and for the first time in weeks, he felt as though the terrible weight he had been carrying alone might finally be shared. Over the following days, Eli and Walter developed a careful, quiet system of observation, taking turns watching the estate gates during the hours when the unmarked carriage had historically appeared, comparing notes each evening in the privacy of the stable loft, well away from curious ears. They learned that the carriage's driver, a man who never removed his wide-brimmed hat regardless of the weather, always arrived and departed along the same narrow lane that ran behind the eastern pasture, a route rarely used by the estate's other visitors, chosen clearly for its privacy rather than its convenience. They also learned, through careful questioning of the kitchen staff that Walter conducted with far more subtlety than Eli could have managed on his own, that the physician who had attended the Duchess on the night of her death, a man named Dr. Arthur Lane, had left the region entirely within weeks of her passing, relocating to a distant county under circumstances that no one seemed able to fully explain. The kitchen staff spoke of it as a strange coincidence, nothing more, but to Eli and Walter, armed with the knowledge of the hidden letter's chilling reference to a physician compensated for his discretion, the timing felt anything but coincidental. 5 days before the Duke's scheduled departure, Eli made a discovery that finally gave their quiet investigation the solid proof Walter had insisted they needed. He had been sent by his mother to deliver a message to the head footman, whose small office sat just off the main entrance hall, and as he waited outside the closed door for the footman to finish a conversation within, he overheard, quite by accident, a portion of dialogue that made him freeze completely still. It was Lord Pembroke's voice, unmistakable in its smooth, careful cadence, speaking not to the footman but to someone else entirely, someone whose voice Eli did not recognize at all, rough and low, clearly a man unaccustomed to the polished manners of the manor's usual visitors. The 13th, as we discussed. Everything must appear entirely ordinary. No deviation from the planned route, no unnecessary delay. You understand the importance of precision in this matter. I understand well enough. Same arrangement as before, payment upon completion. Precisely as before, though I trust you understand this arrangement carries considerably more weight than our previous business together. Discretion, above all else, is paramount. Should anything go wrong, should any suspicion fall upon this household, the consequences will extend to you as surely as to myself. You've made your point clear enough, my lord. I've never failed to deliver on an arrangement yet, and I don't intend to start now. Eli stood frozen outside the door, his heart pounding so violently he feared the 2 men within might somehow hear it. The 13th. He knew, without needing to check the small calendar kept in the kitchen, that the 13th was the exact date scheduled for the Duke's departure to the capital, the very date that had been circled and discussed by the household staff for weeks now in their preparations. He backed away from the door as quietly as he could manage, his message to the footman entirely forgotten, and hurried through the manor's corridors until he found Walter in the stables, breathless and shaking with the terrible urgency of what he had just overheard. "It's the 13th," he gasped, once he had managed to pull Walter aside into the privacy of an empty stall. "That's when it's happening, whatever it is. I heard Lord Pembroke himself, speaking to someone, arranging payment for something that has to happen exactly as planned with no deviation." Walter's face had gone pale. The 13th is the Duke's departure date. "I know." For a long moment, neither boy spoke, the terrible weight of their shared understanding settling heavily between them in the quiet dimness of the stable. Finally, Walter broke the silence, his voice tight with a fear he could no longer fully hide beneath his usual calm composure. "We have 4 days, Eli. 4 days to find a way to stop whatever is being planned, or to warn someone who can actually do something about it, before the Duke steps into that carriage." Eli nodded, his own fear mingling with a fierce, determined resolve that surprised even himself. He thought of the Duke's brief, unexpected kindness in the garden that evening weeks before, the quiet grief he had glimpsed beneath the man's careful formality, the way he had spoken of his late wife's love for the very stables where Eli now stood. Whatever else the Duke might be, Whatever distance and formality defined his interactions with the household staff, he did not deserve to walk unknowingly into whatever danger Lord Pembroke and his unnamed accomplice had so carefully, so patiently arranged. "Then we don't have any more time to waste," Eli said quietly. "We need to find real proof, something we can show him directly, something he can't possibly ignore." Walter nodded slowly, his expression grim but resolute. "Then let's get started. And Eli, this time, we don't do anything foolish on our own. Whatever we find, we bring it forward together, and we make certain someone with real power actually listens." Eli agreed, though even as he spoke the words, a small, uneasy voice in the back of his mind wondered whether 4 days would truly be enough time, and whether, when the moment finally came, anyone with the power to stop what was coming would actually be willing to listen to a stable hand and a housekeeper's son. The 4 days that followed passed with an unbearable slowness, each hour stretching thin under the weight of what Eli and Walter now knew. The household, meanwhile, continued its preparations for the Duke's departure with the same steady efficiency it always showed, entirely unaware of the quiet fear building among 2 of its youngest members. The Duke's routine in the days leading up to any journey to the capital was, as Eli quickly learned through careful observation, remarkably consistent. He rose early, breakfasted alone in his study rather than the grand dining hall, and spent the better part of each morning reviewing correspondence and estate matters with the assistance of his personal secretary, a soft-spoken older man named Henry Doyle, who had served the Ashcombe family for nearly 30 years. In the afternoons, the Duke typically walked the gardens, as was his habit, before retreating once more to his study for the remainder of the evening. It was Henry Doyle, Eli realized, who might offer the best hope of reaching the Duke with their suspicions. Unlike Lord Pembroke, whose relationship with the Duke seemed built on convenience and the exploitation of grief, Doyle had served the family for decades, long before the Duchess's death, long before Pembroke had begun inserting himself so thoroughly into the estate's affairs. If anyone might listen to a boy's fears without dismissing them outright, Eli reasoned, it would be a man who had known the family for that long. He shared this idea with Walter the following evening, and though the older boy remained cautious, he agreed it was worth attempting. "But we can't simply walk up to him with wild claims and no proof," Walter cautioned. "We need something solid, something he can verify for himself. Otherwise we risk being dismissed just as easily as your mother dismissed you. And worse, we risk word getting back to Lord Pembroke that someone has been asking questions." This last point struck Eli with sudden, sharp clarity. If Lord Pembroke learned that his careful scheme had been discovered, even partially, by 2 children on the estate, what might he do to protect himself? The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through him, one that made him understand, perhaps for the first time, the true danger of what they were attempting. They agreed to proceed with extreme caution. Rather than approaching Henry Doyle directly, which risked drawing unwanted attention, they decided instead to gather whatever additional evidence they could over the remaining days, hoping to build a case solid enough that even the most skeptical adult could not easily dismiss it. 2 days before the Duke's scheduled departure, Eli returned once more to the stable loft, this time accompanied by Walter, hoping to find some additional detail in the hidden ledger that might reveal more about the identity of Lord Pembroke's mysterious accomplice, the rough-voiced man Eli had overheard through the closed study door. They found the ledger exactly where Eli had left it, and this time, with Walter's steadier hand and slightly more advanced understanding of financial records, they were able to decipher considerably more of its contents than Eli had managed on his own. "These entries here," Walter said, pointing to a series of payments recorded over the past several months, "they're all made to the same account. See this notation, SM, that could be initials." Eli felt a jolt of recognition. The driver. I've never heard anyone say his name, but if he's been paid for previous jobs before this one, maybe those initials belong to him. Walter nodded slowly, continuing to trace the ledger's entries with his finger. And look here, at the bottom of this page. It says the same thing as before, 13th confirmed, but there's an additional note I missed before. Route unchanged, per usual arrangement with driver. The words sent a chill through both boys. Whatever was planned for the 13th clearly involved altering nothing about the Duke's usual travel arrangements, meaning the danger, whatever its exact nature, would be disguised as something entirely ordinary, something no one would think twice about until it was far too late to prevent. "We need to know who this driver is," Eli said. "If we can identify him, put a name to the man behind that hat and coat, maybe that's enough proof to bring to Doyle." Walter agreed, though neither of them could think of a practical way to accomplish this without risking discovery themselves. They spent the remainder of that afternoon debating various plans, each one discarded as too dangerous or too likely to draw unwanted attention, until finally Walter proposed an idea that, while risky, seemed to offer their best chance of success. "The carriage always arrives along the lane behind the eastern pasture," he said. "If we position ourselves carefully, hidden well enough not to be seen, we might be able to get close enough to see the driver's face when he removes his hat, assuming he ever does. Or at the very least, we might spot some other detail that could help identify him." It was, Eli agreed, their best remaining option with so little time left before the Duke's departure. They resolved to make the attempt the following evening, the last night before the scheduled 13th, when their carefully kept records suggested the unmarked carriage was likely to make one final appearance before the day itself. That night, waiting for the appointed time in the darkness of the stable loft, Eli found himself thinking of his father for the first time in many months. He remembered very little of the man directly, having been so young when he passed, but he remembered fragments, a deep, steady voice reading to him before bed, strong hands lifting him onto broad shoulders, and most of all, a fierce, unwavering sense that his father had been a man who noticed things others overlooked, who cared deeply about setting right whatever seemed wrong in the world around him. His mother had said more than once that Eli possessed the same quality, though she had always said it with a note of worry in her voice, as though it were a trait that brought as much difficulty as it did purpose. Sitting in the darkness now, waiting for the moment when he and Walter would attempt something genuinely dangerous in pursuit of the truth, Eli understood for the first time what she might have meant. The following evening arrived with an oppressive, heavy stillness, as though the entire estate sensed that something significant was approaching. Eli and Walter made their way carefully to the eastern pasture, just as the last light of day was fading from the sky, positioning themselves behind a dense cluster of hawthorn bushes that grew alongside the narrow lane, offering concealment while still allowing a reasonably clear view of anyone passing along the path. They waited in tense silence for what felt like hours, though Eli's careful accounting afterward suggested it had been closer to 40 minutes, before the familiar sound of carriage wheels finally reached their ears, growing steadily louder as the unmarked black carriage approached along the darkened lane. Eli held his breath as it drew nearer, straining to make out any details of the driver through the gathering darkness. The man remained just as obscured as ever, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, his heavy coat collar turned up despite the mild evening air, seemingly determined to reveal nothing of himself even in the privacy of what he clearly believed to be an unwatched moment. But as the carriage drew almost level with their hiding place, something unexpected happened. A sudden gust of wind swept through the pasture, strong enough to catch the brim of the driver's hat and tilt it briefly upward before he could catch it and press it back into place. In that fleeting moment, illuminated by the last pale light of dusk, Eli caught a clear glimpse of the man's face. He was perhaps 40 years of age, with a weathered, sun-browned complexion and a distinctive scar running from the corner of his left eye down toward his jaw, pale and old enough to suggest it had been there for many years. It was not a face Eli recognized, not someone he had ever seen among the estate's regular visitors or staff, but it was a face he now committed firmly to memory, certain that such a distinctive mark would make the man identifiable to anyone who had encountered him before. Beside him, Walter had seen it too, and the two boys exchanged a wide-eyed glance in the darkness, understanding without words that they had just gained something genuinely valuable to their case. They waited until the carriage had disappeared entirely from view before finally daring to move from their hiding place, both boys practically vibrating with the mixture of fear and excitement that came from having successfully completed something so clearly dangerous. "A scar," Walter breathed, once they had put sufficient distance between themselves and the lane. Running from his eye to his jaw, someone on this estate must have seen him before, must know who he is. "Doyle," Eli said immediately. "He's served this family for 30 years. If this man has ever done business with Lord Pembroke before, even years ago, Doyle might have crossed paths with him, or at least heard his name mentioned." They agreed that the following morning, with only one day remaining before the Duke's scheduled departure, they would finally take their evidence to Henry Doyle, however great the risk of dismissal or discovery might be. They had run out of time to gather anything more, and whatever they possessed now, the hidden ledger, the overheard conversation, the scarred face glimpsed beneath a tilted hat, would simply have to be enough. But that night, as Eli lay awake beside his sleeping mother, turning the day's events over in his mind, a new and terrible thought occurred to him. What if Doyle, despite his decades of service, was not so different from the rest of the household staff, quick to dismiss the fears of two young boys as nothing more than overactive imagination? What if the morning came and went, and they found themselves standing before the Duke's departure with nothing but a story too incredible to be believed? He did not sleep well that night, his mind circling endlessly through every possible outcome of the confrontation to come. And when morning finally arrived, gray and cold, carrying with it the unmistakable weight of the single day remaining before the 13th, Eli rose from his bed with a grim, quiet determination that felt, for the first time, entirely his own. Whatever happened, he resolved, he would not let fear or the dismissal of adults stop him from doing everything within his power to protect a man who, despite barely knowing him, had shown him unexpected kindness in a garden weeks before, a man who deserved to know the truth of what had happened to his wife, and who deserved, more than anything, to survive whatever terrible plan had been so carefully, so patiently set in motion against him. Henry Doyle's office sat at the end of a narrow corridor on the ground floor of the manor, tucked away from the grander rooms used to receive visitors, a modest space filled with towering shelves of ledgers and correspondence that spanned decades of the Ashcombe family's history. Eli and Walter approached it early that morning, before the household had fully stirred, hoping to catch the elderly secretary alone before his duties for the day began in earnest. They found him exactly where Walter had predicted, seated at his cluttered desk, a cup of tea cooling beside him as he reviewed a stack of correspondence by the pale morning light filtering through the room's single window. He looked up as the two boys hesitated in his doorway, his expression curious but not unkind. "Well now," he said, setting down the letter he had been reading, "this is an unusual sight. What brings the stable hand and the housekeeper's son to my door so early in the morning?" Eli glanced at Walter, drawing courage from his presence before stepping forward. "Mr. Doyle, sir, we need to speak with you about something important, something concerning the Duke's safety and his journey tomorrow." Doyle's eyebrows rose slightly, though his expression remained patient. "That's a serious claim for two young men to bring to my door. Go on then, I'm listening." And so Eli told him everything, more calmly and clearly than he had managed with Walter weeks before, having had time now to organize his thoughts into something resembling a coherent account. He spoke of the ledger hidden in the stable loft, of the strange crescent symbol that appeared both in its pages and carved into the door of an unmarked carriage, of the overheard conversation between Lord Pembroke and an unnamed man discussing arrangements for the 13th, and finally, of the scarred face they had glimpsed beneath the driver's hat just the evening before. Doyle listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave as Eli's account unfolded, until by the time the boy finished speaking, the old secretary had gone quite pale, his hands folded tightly together atop his cluttered desk. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, simply staring at some point beyond the two boys as though turning something over carefully in his own mind, some memory or suspicion of his own that Eli's account had suddenly given new and troubling shape. "A scar," Doyle finally said, his voice quiet, running from the eye to the jaw. "Yes, sir," Eli confirmed, his heart quickening at the recognition in the old man's expression. "Do you know him?" Doyle rose slowly from his desk and moved to one of the towering shelves lining his office walls, running his fingers along a row of ledgers until he found the one he sought, pulling it free and setting it open across his desk with hands that trembled slightly. He turned through several pages before stopping, his finger resting on an entry that made his breath catch audibly. "Nearly 3 years ago," he said, "before the Duchess passed, there was an incident involving a groundskeeper who had been dismissed from service under troubling circumstances, accused of theft from the estate's finances. He denied the charges vehemently, but the evidence against him seemed conclusive at the time, and he was dismissed without further inquiry. His name was Samuel Marsh. He had a scar exactly as you describe, from an accident with a scythe some years before his employment here." Eli felt a chill run through him. SM, the initials in the ledger. Doyle nodded slowly, his expression darkening further. "I remember now, there were whispers at the time that the evidence against Marsh had been arranged rather too conveniently, that someone else may have been responsible for the missing funds and had simply found a scapegoat to bear the blame. I did not think much of those rumors at the time. I certainly never imagined they might connect to something far more serious." "Do you think Lord Pembroke was responsible?" Walter asked. "For getting this man dismissed, I mean all those years ago." Doyle's expression grew troubled. "I cannot say for certain, not without more evidence than we currently possess. But if Marsh believed himself wronged by this household, dismissed unjustly and left with a ruined reputation, he would hardly be difficult to recruit for whatever scheme Lord Pembroke may have devised since then. A man with a grievance and a need for money makes for willing cooperation in matters he might otherwise refuse." The three of them sat in heavy silence for a long moment, the full weight of what they now understood settling over the small office. Finally, Doyle spoke again, his voice carrying a new urgency. "You've done something remarkably brave, both of you, in bringing this to me. But I must ask you honestly, do either of you understand the seriousness of what you're suggesting? If Lord Pembroke truly is responsible for arranging some manner of harm against the Duke, and if he learns that his scheme has been discovered before he can see it through, there is no telling what he might do, not only to protect his plans but to silence anyone who threatens to expose them." Eli swallowed hard, the reality of Doyle's warning settling over him with new weight. "What should we do, then?" Doyle was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the options available to them with the careful deliberation of a man who had spent 30 years managing the delicate affairs of a noble household. "I think," he said finally, "that we must bring this directly to the Duke himself, though we must do so with great care. If we approach him too directly, too suddenly, without adequate proof, he may simply refuse to believe that his own cousin, his late wife's own relation, could be capable of such a thing. Grief makes people cling tightly to the relationships that remain to them, even when those relationships prove unworthy of such trust." "Then how do we convince him?" Eli pressed. "We only have until tomorrow morning before he leaves for the capital." Doyle rose from his desk, moving toward the window with his hands clasped thoughtfully behind his back, an unconscious echo of the very gesture Eli had so often observed in the Duke himself. "I believe our strongest evidence remains the ledger itself, hidden in the stable loft. If I can examine it personally, verify its contents against my own knowledge of the estate's finances, I may be able to present a case to the Duke that carries the weight of 30 years of trusted service behind it, rather than relying solely on the word of two young boys, however honest and observant they may be. It was agreed, then, that Doyle would accompany Eli and Walter to the stable loft that very afternoon to examine the ledger for himself, after which he would determine the best way to approach the Duke with what they had discovered, hopefully in time to prevent whatever danger awaited him should he proceed with his journey as planned. The afternoon could not pass quickly enough for Eli, who found himself unable to focus on any of his usual small duties around the household, his mind consumed entirely by anxious anticipation of what Doyle's examination of the ledger might reveal, and whether it would prove sufficient to convince the Duke of the danger he faced. When the appointed hour finally arrived, the three of them made their way carefully to the stables, taking pains to avoid drawing the attention of other staff members who might wonder at such an unusual gathering. They climbed to the loft together, and Eli pried up the loose floorboard to retrieve the hidden ledger, presenting it to Doyle with hands that had grown steadier over the past weeks of careful, secret investigation. Doyle examined the ledger's contents with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades reviewing the estate's financial records, and his expression grew increasingly grim as he turned through its pages, occasionally pausing to compare certain entries against figures he clearly recalled from his own official records. "These transfers," he said eventually, tapping a finger against a series of entries near the ledger's middle pages, "correspond almost exactly to discrepancies I noticed in the estate's official accounts over the past 2 years, discrepancies I attributed at the time to ordinary administrative error, given how thoroughly Lord Pembroke had taken over management of the estate's finances since the Duchess's passing. I see now that I was entirely too trusting." He continued examining the ledger for several more minutes before finally closing it carefully, his expression settling into something resembling grim resolve. "This is enough," he said. "Combined with what you overheard yesterday and the account of Samuel Marsh's dismissal, I believe we have sufficient grounds to bring this matter directly to the Duke tonight, before his departure tomorrow morning." They agreed that Doyle would request a private audience with the Duke that very evening, presenting the ledger and their combined account of everything they had discovered over the past weeks. Eli and Walter would remain nearby, prepared to answer any questions the Duke might have directly, though Doyle cautioned them that the final decision of how to proceed would ultimately rest with the Duke himself. That evening, as the household settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Doyle requested, and was granted, a private audience with the Duke in his study, the very room where so many of Lord Pembroke's careful, calculated conversations had taken place over the preceding months. Eli and Walter waited anxiously in the corridor outside, straining to hear anything of the conversation taking place within, though the thick study door revealed nothing beyond the low murmur of voices. The wait stretched agonizingly long, nearly half an hour by Eli's careful reckoning, before the study door finally opened and Doyle emerged, his expression difficult to read in the dim corridor light. "He wishes to speak with both of you directly," Doyle said quietly. "Come." Eli's heart pounded as he and Walter stepped into the Duke's study for the first time, a grand room lined with towering bookshelves and lit by the warm glow of a fire crackling in the hearth. Duke Edmund Ashcombe stood near the window, his expression unreadable, the hidden ledger resting open on the desk before him. "Eli Whitfield," the Duke said quietly, turning to face the boy fully. "Henry tells me you have discovered something rather extraordinary and rather troubling." "Yes, Your Grace." Eli's voice trembled slightly despite his best efforts to remain steady. "I didn't mean to find any of it. I stumbled onto the ledger by accident weeks ago, and I couldn't stop thinking about what it might mean once I understood some of what was written inside it." The Duke studied him for a long moment, his expression difficult to read, before turning his attention to Walter. "And you assisted him in this investigation, once he confided in you?" "Yes, Your Grace. I couldn't in good conscience let him carry such a burden alone, not once I understood how serious it might be. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the two boys and the open ledger on his desk, clearly wrestling with the weight of what he had just learned. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying a depth of controlled emotion that Eli had not expected. "My cousin has been a source of considerable support to me since my wife's passing," he said slowly. "I trusted him completely with matters I could not bear to manage myself in my grief. If what you're suggesting is true, if he has been responsible not only for years of financial deception but potentially for some role in my wife's death itself, and now for some manner of danger planned against me directly." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought, his hand tightening visibly against the edge of his desk. "We understand this is difficult to accept, Your Grace," Doyle said gently. "But the evidence, taken together, is difficult to dismiss. I would not have brought this to you otherwise, not without being reasonably certain of its weight." The Duke nodded slowly, seeming to gather himself with visible effort. "What do you propose we do? My departure is scheduled for tomorrow morning. If I simply cancel it without explanation, my cousin will surely realize his scheme has been discovered, and there is no telling what he might do to protect himself, or to silence those responsible for exposing him." It was Doyle who finally proposed a plan, one that would require considerable courage from everyone involved, but which offered the best hope of catching Lord Pembroke and his accomplice with undeniable proof of their intentions, rather than simply allowing the Duke's departure to be quietly cancelled with no real consequence for those responsible. The Duke would proceed with his departure exactly as planned, appearing to suspect nothing at all. But rather than allowing him to actually step into the unmarked carriage when it arrived the following morning, Eli would intervene at the last possible moment, drawing the Duke away under some pretense before he could enter the vehicle, giving Doyle and several trusted members of the household staff the opportunity to confront both Lord Pembroke and the driver directly, with the ledger and their combined testimony serving as undeniable proof of the scheme that had been so carefully constructed against him. It was a dangerous plan, and Eli felt the full weight of its risks settle over him as Doyle explained it. He would be the one required to step forward at the critical moment, to publicly and dramatically prevent the Duke from entering a carriage that everyone else present would believe to be entirely ordinary, drawing immediate and potentially dangerous attention to himself in the process. But when the Duke turned to look at him directly, his expression grave but carrying an unmistakable note of gratitude and respect that Eli had not expected from a man of such elevated status, the boy found his fear settling into something closer to quiet determination. "I understand this asks a great deal of you," the Duke said quietly. "You are under no obligation to take on such a risk on my behalf. If you wish to withdraw from this plan, no one here will think less of you for it." Eli thought of the hidden ledger, of the chilling letter referencing a physician paid for his discretion, of the Duke's quiet, unexpected kindness in the garden weeks before, of a woman named Duchess Eleanor who had loved the very stables where Eli now spent so much of his time, whose death had never received the justice it deserved. "I'll do it, Your Grace," he said, his voice steadier than he had expected. "Someone has to stop this before it's too late." The Duke studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind his careful, guarded expression before he nodded slowly. "Then we proceed as Henry has suggested. And Eli, whatever happens tomorrow morning, you should know that your courage in bringing this forward will not be forgotten, regardless of how the day unfolds." As Eli and Walter finally left the study that night, the weight of what tomorrow would demand settling heavily over both of them, Eli found himself thinking once more of his father, of the fierce, unwavering sense of purpose he barely remembered but somehow still carried within himself. Tomorrow, he understood, would demand every bit of that inherited courage, and more besides, if they were to succeed in exposing the truth and protecting the Duke from whatever terrible fate had been so carefully, so patiently arranged against him. He did not sleep at all that night, watching instead through the small window of the room he shared with his mother, as the darkness slowly gave way to the first pale light of the 13th, the day that would determine, one way or another, the fate of everyone involved in the quiet, dangerous truth he had uncovered. The morning of the 13th arrived cold and clear, the kind of crisp autumn morning that would have seemed entirely ordinary under any other circumstances. Eli rose before dawn, his stomach twisted into tight knots of nervous anticipation, and dressed quietly so as not to wake his mother, who remained entirely unaware of the plan that had been set into motion the night before. He made his way to the stables first, where Walter was already waiting, his own expression betraying the same restless tension that Eli felt coursing through his own veins. "Doyle's spoken with the head footman and two of the more trusted grooms," Walter said quietly, keeping his voice low despite the early hour and the emptiness of the stable yard. "They'll be positioned near the courtyard, ready to move the moment you draw the Duke away from the carriage." Eli nodded, though his mouth had gone entirely dry. "And the carriage, has it been sighted yet?" "Not yet. But based on the pattern you and I have tracked these past weeks, it should arrive within the hour, ahead of the Duke's scheduled departure time." They waited together in tense silence, watching the courtyard from a careful distance as the household began its usual morning preparations, entirely unaware of the danger that approached. Servants moved back and forth from the main house, carrying the Duke's traveling trunks toward the front steps, arranging them in neat, orderly rows in preparation for loading. The Duke himself emerged from the house shortly before the appointed hour, dressed for travel, his expression composed and betraying nothing of the knowledge he now carried. Eli watched him cross the courtyard with a growing sense of dread, understanding that within moments, everything they had worked toward over the past weeks would either succeed in protecting this man or fail catastrophically, with consequences none of them could fully predict. And then, precisely on schedule, the unmarked black carriage rolled through the estate gates, its black paint gleaming under the pale morning light, its curtains drawn tightly shut exactly as they always were, its driver hidden beneath the familiar wide-brimmed hat that Eli now knew concealed the scarred face of a man named Samuel Marsh. The carriage came to a stop at the base of the front steps, precisely where the Duke's usual travel arrangements always positioned it, and Eli felt his heart begin to hammer so violently he feared everyone in the courtyard might somehow hear it. He glanced toward Walter, who gave him a small, steadying nod, before both boys began making their way toward the front steps, careful to appear as though they were simply going about ordinary morning errands. The Duke approached the carriage with measured, deliberate steps, his hand reaching for the door handle exactly as it always did before any journey. Eli understood with sudden, sharp clarity that this was the moment, the single instant upon which everything now depended. He broke into a run. "Don't enter that carriage," he called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard with far more force than he had believed himself capable of producing. Every head within the courtyard turned toward him, servants pausing mid-task, the Duke himself freezing with his hand still resting against the carriage door. "Follow me, Your Grace. Please, you have to follow me." For a single, terrible moment, Eli feared his desperate plea would fail entirely, that the Duke, startled by such an unexpected and dramatic interruption from a mere servant's son, would simply dismiss him outright and proceed with entering the carriage as planned. The courtyard fell into stunned, uncertain silence, every servant present staring at the strange scene unfolding before them, clearly uncertain how to respond to such an unprecedented breach of propriety. But the Duke did not immediately dismiss him. Instead, he remained frozen at the carriage door, his hand still resting against its handle, his expression shifting rapidly from startled confusion to something far more complicated, a flicker of the very fear and uncertainty that Doyle's revelation the night before had planted so firmly within him. "Eli," he said slowly, his voice carrying just enough uncertainty that Eli understood the plan they had so carefully constructed the night before might actually succeed. "What is the meaning of this?" Eli forced himself to hold the Duke's gaze steadily, drawing on every ounce of courage he possessed. "Please, Your Grace, I know this seems strange, and I know everyone here must think I've lost my senses entirely. But I promise you, if you enter that carriage, you may not live to regret it. I need you to trust me just this once and follow me to the stables. I can show you proof of everything right now, if you'll only come with me." The courtyard remained frozen in stunned silence, servants exchanging bewildered glances, clearly torn between the impropriety of a boy so boldly addressing the Duke in such a manner, and the unmistakable urgency carried in Eli's voice. Near the edge of the gathered crowd, Eli caught sight of his mother, who had emerged from the house at the commotion, her face pale with confusion and mounting alarm at the sight of her son creating such a dramatic scene in front of the entire household. The driver, meanwhile, remained seated atop the carriage, his hat still pulled low, but Eli noticed a subtle stiffening in his posture, a tension that suggested he understood, perhaps better than anyone else present, exactly what kind of threat Eli's intervention represented to whatever plan had been so carefully arranged for this very morning. For a long, agonizing moment, the Duke simply stood there, his hand still resting against the carriage door, his gaze moving between Eli's desperate, pleading expression and the unmarked vehicle before him, clearly wrestling with a decision that felt, to everyone watching, far more significant than the simple choice it might have appeared to be under ordinary circumstances. Then slowly, deliberately, the Duke withdrew his hand from the carriage door. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the murmuring that had begun to spread through the assembled servants. "I will follow you, Eli Whitfield, but I trust you understand the seriousness of what you're asking of me, and the consequences should this prove to be nothing more than a child's overactive imagination." "I understand, Your Grace," Eli said, relief flooding through him with such force that his legs nearly buckled beneath him. "I promise you it's not imagination. Please, this way." As the Duke turned away from the carriage and began following Eli across the courtyard, a ripple of confusion and alarm spread through the gathered servants, none of whom fully understood what was happening, but all of whom sensed, correctly, that something significant and entirely unprecedented was unfolding before them. Eli caught a glimpse of the driver shifting uncomfortably atop his seat, his hand moving toward something concealed within his heavy coat, before seeming to think better of drawing further attention to himself. And Eli felt a fresh wave of fear at how close they might have come to catastrophe had he hesitated even a moment longer. Behind them, near the edge of the courtyard, Eli spotted Doyle emerging from the house with the head footman and 2 grooms, moving with quiet purpose toward the carriage now that the Duke himself was safely clear of it, ready to begin the confrontation that would, one way or another, finally bring the truth of Lord Pembroke's scheme fully into the light. But that confrontation, Eli understood as he led the Duke toward the stables with his heart still pounding fiercely in his chest, was only the beginning of what remained to be uncovered that terrible, extraordinary morning. The ledger waited in the loft exactly where he had left it, ready to reveal its damning secrets to the one man who had the power to finally act upon them. And somewhere within the manor, entirely unaware that his carefully constructed scheme had just unraveled in the span of a few desperate, terrifying moments, Lord Pembroke continued about his morning routine, blind to the reckoning that was rapidly approaching. As they crossed the final stretch of courtyard toward the stable entrance, the Duke glanced back once toward the carriage, his expression unreadable in the pale morning light, before turning his full attention forward, following the housekeeper's son toward whatever truth awaited him in the quiet dimness of the stable loft, utterly speechless at the strange, sudden unraveling of the ordinary morning he had expected only moments before. The stable felt strangely quiet after the chaos of the courtyard, the familiar scent of hay and horses offering a small, steadying comfort, even as Eli's heart continued to race with the enormity of what he had just done. The Duke followed him inside without a word, his expression composed but his eyes betraying a sharp, watchful uncertainty that had not been present in their brief exchange weeks before. "Up here, your grace," Eli said, gesturing toward the rickety ladder leading to the loft. "I'm sorry there isn't a more dignified way to reach it." To his surprise, the Duke offered a faint, humorless smile. Dignity seems a small concern this morning, given the circumstances. He climbed the ladder without further comment, and Eli followed close behind, his hands trembling slightly as he made his way to the loose floorboard one final time. He pried it free and lifted the hidden ledger into the dim morning light filtering through the loft's single window, presenting it to the Duke with both hands, as though offering something far heavier than its actual weight suggested. "I found this weeks ago, quite by accident," Eli explained, watching the Duke's face carefully as he accepted the worn leather book. "I didn't understand most of what was written inside at first. But Mr. Doyle helped me understand it better, once we finally brought everything to him." The Duke opened the ledger slowly, his expression unreadable as he began turning through its pages, and Eli watched a visible transformation take hold of him as he read. The careful composure he had maintained throughout the strange events of the morning gradually giving way to something far rawer, far more difficult to witness. His hands, Eli noticed, had begun to tremble slightly as he turned each page, and by the time he reached the hidden letter tucked inside the ledger's cover, his face had gone entirely pale. He read the letter twice, his lips moving silently over certain phrases, before finally lowering the ledger and turning to face Eli directly, his eyes carrying a depth of grief and fury that made the boy take an involuntary step backward. "The physician has been compensated adequately for his discretion regarding the events of that night," the Duke read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper, before lifting his gaze to meet Eli's directly. "This refers to my wife, to Alina." "Yes, your grace, I believe it does." The Duke closed his eyes briefly, drawing a long, unsteady breath, and for a moment Eli feared the man might simply collapse under the sudden, overwhelming weight of what he had just learned. But when he opened his eyes again, something had shifted within his expression, the raw grief giving way to a hardened, determined resolve that reminded Eli, unexpectedly, of the fierce protectiveness he sometimes glimpsed in his own mother's eyes. "I have suspected in the quiet hours when grief allows for such thoughts that Alina's death was not as simple as I had been told," the Duke said slowly. "But I never allowed myself to fully entertain such suspicions, not without proof, and certainly not directed toward my own cousin, a man I trusted implicitly in the aftermath of losing her." He looked down at the ledger once more, his jaw tightening. "It seems that trust was profoundly, catastrophically misplaced." "Your Grace," Eli said carefully, "there's more. Walter and I overheard Lord Pembroke speaking with someone, just days ago, arranging something for today specifically, the 13th. And the driver of that carriage, the one you were about to enter, we believe his name is Samuel Marsh, a man dismissed from this estate years ago under circumstances Mr. Doyle now believes may have been arranged by Lord Pembroke himself to cover his own theft." The Duke absorbed this information with visible effort, his hands tightening around the ledger's worn leather cover. "And you believe this Marsh was hired to ensure I never reached the capital at all? Is that the shape of what you're suggesting?" Eli hesitated, uncertain how directly to voice the fear that had been building within him for weeks. "I don't know exactly what was planned, your Grace. But I know it frightened me enough that I couldn't stand by and let you step into that carriage without at least trying to stop you." The Duke studied him for a long moment, something profound and difficult to name passing across his features. "You risked a great deal this morning, Eli Whitfield. Your reputation, certainly, standing before the entire household and creating such a scene. Quite possibly a great deal more than that, had my cousin's scheme proceeded and had he later learned of your involvement in exposing it." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "I owe you a debt I am not certain I can ever adequately repay." Before Eli could respond, the sound of raised voices drifted up from the courtyard below, carrying clearly through the loft's open window. The Duke's expression sharpened immediately, and he moved quickly to the window, Eli close behind him, both of them peering down into the courtyard, where a scene of considerable commotion had begun to unfold. Doyle, along with the head footman and the two grooms, had positioned themselves around the unmarked carriage, and even from this distance, Eli could see that the driver, Samuel Marsh, had climbed down from his seat, his posture rigid with obvious alarm as he found himself suddenly surrounded. Doyle appeared to be speaking to him directly, gesturing toward the carriage and toward the main house, though Eli could not make out the specific words being exchanged from such a distance. "They've moved to detain him," the Duke observed grimly, "before he can attempt to flee or destroy any evidence he might be carrying." As they watched, Marsh's gaze darted rapidly between the servants surrounding him and the open gates beyond, and for one tense moment, Eli feared the man might attempt to force his way past them entirely, perhaps even attempt to flee on foot across the estate grounds. But whatever calculation passed through the driver's mind in that moment, he seemed to recognize the impossibility of escape, his shoulders slumping slightly as Doyle continued speaking to him, gesturing now toward the main house with unmistakable authority. "We should go down," the Duke said, closing the ledger firmly and tucking it beneath his arm. "This matter requires my direct attention now, and my cousin must be confronted before word of this morning's events reaches him from any other source." They descended the ladder quickly, Eli's mind racing with anticipation of what still remained to unfold that morning. As they emerged from the stable back into the courtyard, the Duke's expression had settled into something Eli had not yet seen from him, a controlled, formidable authority that seemed to command immediate attention from everyone present, servants straightening and falling silent as he crossed the courtyard with brisk, purposeful strides. "Bring Marsh to my study," the Duke instructed the assembled grooms, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "And send word immediately to Lord Pembroke that I require his presence there as well, on a matter of considerable urgency." As the grooms moved to comply, escorting the visibly shaken driver toward the main house, Eli caught sight of his mother once more, standing near the edge of the courtyard with an expression of complete bewilderment, clearly struggling to understand how the morning had transformed so rapidly from an ordinary departure into something so dramatically unprecedented. She caught his eye across the courtyard, and Eli offered her a small, reassuring nod, though he understood there would be a great deal of explaining still required once the immediate crisis had been resolved. For now, though, there was no time to address her confusion directly. The Duke was already moving toward the main house, the ledger tucked firmly beneath his arm, his expression carrying the unmistakable weight of a man preparing to confront a betrayal that ran far deeper than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. "Eli," the Duke called back over his shoulder, not slowing his purposeful stride, "I would ask that you and your companion accompany me to my study as well. Given everything you have uncovered, I believe you have more than earned the right to see this matter through to its conclusion." Eli exchanged a quick glance with Walter, who had appeared at his side sometime during the confusion of the past several minutes, both boys understanding that whatever awaited them in the Duke's study would likely prove to be the most significant confrontation either of them had ever witnessed. Together, they followed the Duke toward the main house, the morning's dramatic events far from finished, the truth of Lord Pembroke's careful, patient scheme still waiting to be fully unraveled before the entire household. The Duke's study, which had so recently been the setting for the quiet, urgent conversation between Doyle and the Duke the night before, now became the stage for something far larger and more consequential. Samuel Marsh was brought in first, still visibly shaken, his weathered face pale beneath the scar that ran from his eye to his jaw, and positioned before the Duke's desk under the watchful presence of the two grooms who had escorted him from the courtyard. The Duke seated himself behind his desk, the ledger placed deliberately before him where Marsh could see it clearly, and studied the driver for a long, silent moment before finally speaking. "You have a choice before you, Marsh," the Duke said, his voice carrying a controlled authority that filled the room despite its quiet measure. "You can tell me everything you know about the arrangement made with my cousin, Lord Pembroke, regarding today's journey, and regarding whatever else you may have done on his behalf these past 2 years. Or you can remain silent and allow the full weight of the law to fall upon you as though you alone were responsible for whatever scheme was planned against me. I suspect you understand which choice serves your interests better." Marsh's jaw worked silently for a moment, his eyes darting between the Duke, the ledger on the desk, and Doyle standing quietly near the study door, before something in his posture finally seemed to collapse under the weight of the situation. "I never meant for anyone real harm, my lord," he said, his rough voice unsteady. "I want you to understand that. What I was told, what I was paid for, was simply to ensure the carriage never reached the capital as scheduled. A delay, a diversion along a route where certain difficulties might arise, giving the appearance of misfortune rather than design. I was never told the specifics of what those difficulties might entail, only that I would be compensated generously for ensuring the arrangement proceeded exactly as instructed, and that questions were neither welcome nor wise." The Duke's expression darkened considerably. "And you agreed to this, despite having no knowledge of what danger it might pose to my life?" Marsh's shoulders sagged further. "I was dismissed from this estate 3 years ago, my lord, accused of theft I never committed. I lost my position, my reputation, everything I had built here over a decade of honest service. When Lord Pembroke approached me some months later, offering payment for small errands, deliveries, and eventually more significant arrangements, I told myself I owed this household nothing, given how unjustly I had been treated. I see now how thoroughly I was used, how my own grievance was turned into a weapon against a man who likely had no part in the wrong done to me." Doyle stepped forward at this, his expression grave. "You claim you were falsely accused of theft. Do you know now who was actually responsible for those missing funds?" Marsh nodded slowly, bitterness creeping into his weathered features. "I did not know for certain at the time, though I suspected. It became clearer once Lord Pembroke began approaching me with his various arrangements, always paid in cash, always requiring absolute discretion. I believe now that he arranged my dismissal deliberately, to remove someone who might otherwise have questioned his growing control over the estate's finances, and to leave me sufficiently desperate and resentful that I would prove willing to assist him later, when he required someone outside the household to carry out tasks he could not entrust to his usual associates." The Duke absorbed this with visible effort, his hands pressed flat against the surface of his desk, as though bracing himself against the weight of the betrayal being revealed piece by careful piece. "And what of my wife?" he said finally, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "What do you know of the night she died?" Marsh hesitated, and for a moment Eli feared he might refuse to answer this particular question, might claim ignorance to protect himself from whatever consequences a more complete confession might invite. But finally, the driver spoke, his voice carrying a note of genuine, uncomfortable regret. "I know only fragments, my lord, gathered from careless remarks Lord Pembroke made in my presence over the past year. Remarks he perhaps believed I was too simple or too indifferent to properly understand. I believe the physician who attended the Duchess that night, a Dr. Lane, was paid a considerable sum to certify her death as natural, resulting from a weakness of the heart, when the truth was something rather different. I do not know the full details of what actually transpired that night, my lord, and I swear to you I had no part in it whatsoever, having only begun my association with Lord Pembroke some months after her passing. But I have heard enough, in careless moments and half-finished sentences, to believe that her death was no accident, and that Lord Pembroke's hand was involved in bringing it about, whether directly or through arrangements made on his behalf." The study fell into heavy, stunned silence following this revelation, the Duke's face having gone entirely ashen, his hands trembling visibly now against the desk. Eli watched the man he had known for only a few months absorb this confirmation of his deepest, most terrible fears, and felt a fierce, protective anger building within himself on the Duke's behalf, anger toward a man he had never spoken to directly, but whose careful, calculating cruelty had already caused so much devastating harm. It was at this precise moment that a commotion arose from the corridor outside the study, and moments later, the door opened to reveal Lord Pembroke himself, summoned by the message the Duke had sent earlier, his expression carrying the same easy, pleasant smile he always wore, though it faltered slightly as his gaze swept across the room and took in the unexpected scene before him. The Duke seated grimly behind his desk, the ledger open before him, Samuel Marsh standing pale and shaken between two grooms, and Doyle positioned near the door with an expression of controlled, righteous fury that Eli had never before seen on the elderly secretary's usually placid features. "Edmund," Lord Pembroke said carefully, his gaze flickering briefly toward Marsh before settling back on the Duke, his composure visibly straining even as he maintained his pleasant tone. "I received your message. Is something amiss? I understood you were meant to be departing for the capital this very morning." The Duke rose slowly from his desk, the ledger clutched in one hand, and Eli watched as decades of careful, formal restraint seemed to fall away from him entirely, replaced by a raw, controlled fury that made even Lord Pembroke take an involuntary step backward. "Amiss," the Duke repeated quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that filled the room with palpable tension. "Yes, cousin, I would say something is very much amiss. Perhaps you would care to explain to me exactly what this ledger contains, and why it happens to be filled with detailed records of funds embezzled from this estate over the past 2 years, transferred to accounts bearing initials that match your own private financial arrangements." Lord Pembroke's careful composure cracked visibly at the sight of the ledger, his eyes widening for just a moment before he seemed to catch himself, forcing his expression back into something resembling calm reasonableness. "I don't know what you imagine you found, Edmund, but I assure you there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for whatever discrepancies you believe you've discovered. Estate finances are complicated matters, and I have managed them faithfully on your behalf during a time of considerable personal difficulty for you." "Faithfully?" the Duke repeated, his voice carrying withering disdain. "Is that the word you would choose to describe arranging my carriage to be diverted along a dangerous route today, cousin? Or perhaps you would prefer to explain the letter tucked inside this ledger's cover, referencing a physician compensated for his discretion regarding the events of a particular night, a letter that speaks quite plainly of securing what should have been yours from the beginning, had circumstances been arranged more favorably." Lord Pembroke's face had gone entirely white now, all pretense of calm reasonableness abandoned as the full weight of his exposure settled over him. His gaze darted toward Marsh, clearly understanding now the extent of what the driver must have revealed, before flickering toward the study door as though calculating, even now, whether some path of escape remained available to him. "I don't know what that man has told you," Pembroke began, his voice losing much of its practiced smoothness, "but whatever accusations he's made against me are surely the desperate fabrications of a man caught in his own wrongdoing, attempting to shift blame onto—" "Enough," the Duke said, his voice cutting through Pembroke's protests with absolute finality. "I have heard enough this morning, cousin, to understand the true shape of everything that has happened in this household these past 2 years, my wife's death, the systematic theft from this estate's finances, and this morning's arrangement, designed to ensure I never reach the capital at all, leaving you, I presume, as the primary beneficiary of whatever inheritance or continued control might follow my own untimely passing." Pembroke's mouth opened and closed several times, no coherent defense emerging, his careful composure entirely abandoned now as the reality of his exposure settled fully over him. In the silence that followed, Eli found himself watching the man's face closely, searching for some sign of genuine remorse beneath the panic, but finding only calculation, only the desperate, scrambling search for some remaining avenue of escape. It was Doyle who finally broke the tense silence, stepping forward with quiet, formal authority. "Your Grace, I would recommend we summon the local magistrate immediately, along with sufficient household staff to ensure Lord Pembroke, does not attempt to flee before proper authorities can address these charges directly. The Duke nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving his cousin's stricken face. "See to it, Henry, and send word as well requesting that Dr. Lane be located and brought forward to answer for whatever role he played in certifying my wife's death, whether through negligence or deliberate deception." As Doyle moved to comply, Lord Pembroke's composure finally shattered entirely, his careful mask dropping away to reveal something far more desperate and far less controlled beneath it. "You don't understand, Edmund," he said, his voice rising with a mixture of panic and something that sounded almost like genuine grievance. "This estate should have been mine. Eleanor knew it too, in her own way, favoring your claim to the title only through the accident of her marriage to you rather than any genuine merit on your part. I have managed these finances more capably in the past 2 years than you ever did in your own tenure, before grief consumed you so completely that you could barely be bothered to review your own accounts. And so you decided theft and murder were justified means of claiming what you believed yourself owed," the Duke said quietly, his voice carrying a controlled, devastating calm that seemed to affect Pembroke far more powerfully than any outburst of rage might have managed. "I see now, cousin, exactly what kind of man you truly are beneath the pleasant smile you have worn in this household for so many years." Eli watched this final exchange with a strange, complicated mixture of vindication and something closer to sorrow, understanding that whatever satisfaction came from finally exposing the truth could not erase the deep, lasting harm that had already been done to the Duke, to the memory of a duchess who deserved far better than the quiet, hidden injustice of her death, and to an entire household that had spent 2 years unknowingly harboring the architect of such devastating betrayal within its very walls. As Doyle departed to summon the magistrate and additional household staff, and as the grooms moved to ensure Lord Pembroke remained firmly within the study rather than attempting any escape, the Duke turned finally toward Eli and Walter, who had remained quietly near the study door throughout the entire, extraordinary confrontation. "This is far from finished," the Duke said quietly, his voice carrying a weariness that spoke to the enormous emotional toll of the morning's revelations. "There remains a great deal to be properly investigated, and justice to be formally pursued through appropriate legal channels. But I want you both to understand, clearly and without any doubt, that none of this truth would have come to light today were it not for your courage and persistence these past weeks. I owe you a debt that mere words cannot begin to properly address." Eli felt an overwhelming mixture of relief and continued anxiety settle over him, understanding that while the immediate danger of the morning had been averted, the full consequences of everything they had uncovered were only just beginning to unfold. Somewhere within the manor, his mother remained entirely unaware of the true scope of what her son had accomplished that morning, and Eli found himself both eager and deeply apprehensive about the conversation that still awaited them once the immediate crisis had finally settled. But for now, standing in the Duke's study as the full truth of Lord Pembroke's careful, patient betrayal finally unraveled before the entire household, Eli understood that they had accomplished something genuinely significant, something that would reshape not only the Duke's understanding of his own household, but the entire trajectory of justice finally being served for a duchess whose death had gone unquestioned for far too long. The local magistrate, a measured and thorough man named Edward Fenwick, arrived at Ashcombe Manor within the hour, accompanied by 2 constables who took immediate custody of Lord Pembroke, escorting him from the study under formal arrest, while he continued to protest his treatment in increasingly desperate tones that had lost all trace of his earlier smooth, practiced charm. The household staff, gathered in hushed, disbelieving clusters throughout the manor's corridors, watched the extraordinary scene unfold with expressions ranging from shock to something approaching quiet vindication, as though some long-suppressed suspicion within the household had finally, terribly, been confirmed. Eli caught sight of Alice and Margaret, the 2 laundry maids whose whispered conversation weeks earlier had first alerted him to the possibility that the Duchess's death held secrets beyond the official explanation, and their expressions carried a similar mixture of horror and grim confirmation as they watched Lord Pembroke led away. Grace Whitfield found her son shortly after the magistrate's arrival, pulling him aside into a quiet corner of the corridor, with an expression that combined overwhelming relief with considerable, lingering bewilderment. "Eli," she said, gripping his shoulders firmly, her eyes searching his face as though checking for any injury he might have sustained during the morning's dramatic events. "Someone finally explained to me what happened, though I confess I still barely understand it. You discovered all of this weeks ago, and you never told me." Eli met his mother's gaze steadily, understanding that this conversation, difficult as it might prove, was long overdue. "I tried to tell you, Mum, right at the beginning, but you thought I was imagining things, and I understood why you thought that. It did sound like imagination at first. I should have found a better way to convince you, rather than carrying it alone." Grace's expression softened considerably, guilt and pride mingling visibly across her features. "I should have listened more carefully. Your father always said you had an instinct for noticing what others overlooked, and I dismissed it as childish fancy rather than trusting that instinct might occasionally prove correct." She pulled him into a fierce embrace, holding him tightly for a long moment before finally releasing him. "I am so proud of you, Eli, and so deeply grateful that you're safe. When I think of what might have happened, had things unfolded differently this morning." She did not finish the thought, and Eli understood he did not need her to. He simply returned her embrace, grateful beyond words, to have his mother's understanding and support finally restored to him after so many weeks of carrying his fears in careful, lonely silence. Over the following days, as the formal investigation into Lord Pembroke's activities proceeded under Magistrate Fenwick's thorough direction, the full scope of the betrayal gradually came into focus. Dr. Arthur Lane was located within the week, residing under an assumed name in a distant county, and under questioning, he confirmed the terrible truth that had already been suspected. The Duchess had not died of natural causes, but had been administered a substance intended to mimic the appearance of a sudden weakness of the heart, arranged through Lord Pembroke's careful planning, and executed with the physician's compensated complicity. The full details of that terrible night, painful as they were for the Duke and the household to finally confront, brought a measure of closure that 2 years of unanswered questions had never provided. The Duchess's memory could finally be honored with the truth rather than a convenient falsehood, and the household staff, many of whom had genuinely loved and admired Eleanor Ashcombe during her lifetime, found some measure of peace in finally understanding what had truly happened to her, painful as that understanding proved to be. Samuel Marsh, whose cooperation had proven instrumental in unraveling the full scope of Pembroke's scheme, received a considerably reduced sentence in recognition of his assistance, along with a formal acknowledgment from the Duke himself that his original dismissal from the estate years earlier had indeed been unjust, arranged by Pembroke to remove a potential witness to his early financial improprieties. It was a small measure of justice for a man whose life had been derailed by circumstances entirely beyond his control, though it could not fully undo the years of hardship his false accusation had caused. Lord Pembroke himself faced the full weight of formal charges, encompassing not only years of systematic theft from the estate's finances, but complicity in the Duchess's death and the attempted arrangement of harm against the Duke himself. The proceedings that followed drew considerable attention throughout the region, the scandal of a nobleman's betrayal by his own trusted cousin proving too significant a story to remain contained within the quiet walls of Ashcombe Manor alone. Throughout this entire process, Eli found himself called upon repeatedly to provide testimony regarding everything he had discovered and witnessed over the preceding weeks, a role that initially filled him with considerable anxiety, but which he gradually came to approach with growing confidence, understanding that his careful, patient observations had proven genuinely, materially significant in bringing a dangerous and calculating man to justice. The Duke, meanwhile, underwent a transformation that the household staff watched with quiet, hopeful attention over the following weeks. The careful, guarded distance that had defined his interactions with everyone around him since his wife's death began, slowly, to soften, replaced by something closer to the warmth Doyle and the older members of the household staff remembered from before that terrible night 2 years earlier. He began taking his meals once more in the company of his household, rather than isolating himself entirely within his study, and he made a point of personally thanking every member of the staff who had played any role, however small, in exposing his cousin's betrayal and protecting him from whatever fate had awaited him in that unmarked carriage. He also began visiting the stables more frequently. Eli noticed, walking among the very horses his late wife had so dearly loved, and on more than one occasion, Eli glimpsed him standing quietly near Clover's stall, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of grief and something that looked, gradually, increasingly like peace. One evening, roughly 2 weeks after the extraordinary events of the 13th, the Duke summoned Eli and his mother to his study, along with Walter and his own family, for a conversation that would prove to reshape all of their futures in ways none of them had anticipated. "I have given a great deal of thought," the Duke began, once everyone had settled into the comfortable chairs arranged before his desk, "to how I might properly express my gratitude for what has been done for me and for this household. Mere words, I have come to understand, are entirely insufficient to the task." He turned first to Walter, whose family had served in various capacities at Ashcombe Manor for 2 generations. "Walter, your courage and loyalty these past weeks have not gone unnoticed. I would like to sponsor your formal training as a veterinary surgeon, should such a path interest you, given your evident gift with the animals in my stables. The estate will bear the full cost of your education, and a position will remain available to you here, in whatever capacity you ultimately choose, for as long as you wish it." Walter's face broke into an expression of stunned, overwhelming gratitude, and he stammered his thanks with an earnestness that made the Duke's own composed expression soften considerably. Turning next to Eli and his mother, the Duke's expression grew more contemplative. "Grace, your service to this household has been exemplary these past months, and I hope you will continue in your position as housekeeper for as long as you wish to remain here. But it is your son to whom I owe the deepest debt of all, a debt I have thought carefully about how best to honor." He looked directly at Eli then, his expression carrying a warmth and sincerity that made the boy's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Eli, you saved my life through your courage and persistence, at considerable personal risk to yourself. I would like to formally sponsor your education, providing you with tutoring befitting a young man of considerable intelligence and observational skill, with the eventual goal of whatever course of study or profession most interests you as you grow older. Additionally, I intend to establish a trust in your name, ensuring your future security regardless of whatever path you ultimately choose to pursue." Eli sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the magnitude of the Duke's offer settling slowly over him before he finally found his voice. "Your Grace, I don't know what to say. I only did what felt right, what I couldn't have lived with myself for ignoring." "That," the Duke said quietly, "is precisely why you deserve every opportunity I am now able to offer you. The world needs more people willing to act on what feels right, regardless of the personal risk involved, and I intend to ensure that your particular gift for noticing what others overlook is properly nurtured and developed in the years ahead." As the conversation continued, the Duke outlining the practical details of his proposed arrangements with the same careful, methodical attention he had once applied to the ledger that had exposed his cousin's betrayal, Eli found himself overwhelmed by a profound sense of gratitude and relief that extended far beyond the generous opportunities now being offered to him. The terrible weight he had carried alone for so many weeks, the fear and uncertainty of confronting something so much larger than himself, had finally given way to something that felt, for the first time in a very long while, genuinely hopeful. Winter arrived at Ashcombe Manor not long after the trial concluded, and with it came a quiet, gradual healing that spread through the household like the first tentative signs of spring beneath still frozen ground. Lord Pembroke was found guilty on every charge brought against him, his sentence severe enough to ensure he would never again pose any threat to the Duke or the estate he had so thoroughly betrayed. Dr. Lane faced his own formal consequences for the role he had played, and though nothing could fully restore what had been lost, a measure of proper justice had finally been served. Eleanor Ashcombe's memory received, at last, the honor and truth it had long deserved. The Duke commissioned a small, quiet ceremony at her grave beneath the white stone angel, attended by the household staff who had genuinely loved her during her lifetime, a formal acknowledgement that her death had been the result of deliberate cruelty rather than simple, senseless misfortune. It was, Doyle observed quietly to Eli afterward, the first time in 2 years he had seen the Duke weep openly, and somehow everyone present understood it as a necessary, healing grief rather than a fresh wound. Eli's life transformed considerably over the following months, though he was careful never to let the Duke's generous patronage change the fundamental person he understood himself to be. He began his formal tutoring under a kind, patient scholar the Duke retained specifically for his education, and he continued spending his afternoons in the stables with Walter whenever his studies allowed, unwilling to abandon the friendship and the quiet comfort of the horses that had sustained him through the most frightening weeks of his young life. Grace Whitfield settled more fully into her role as housekeeper, the household running with a renewed sense of warmth and purpose under her steady management, and she and Eli found themselves, for the first time since the loss of Eli's father years before, genuinely secure in their circumstances, no longer moving from place to place in search of stable employment, but rather building something that felt, increasingly, like a true and lasting home. The Duke himself continued his gradual transformation from the guarded, grief-stricken man Eli had first encountered upon arriving at Ashcombe Manor into someone who, while still carrying the weight of everything he had lost, had begun to rediscover moments of genuine warmth and purpose in his life. He took a more active role in the estate's daily management, no longer willing to hand such responsibilities entirely to another, having learned the devastating cost of misplaced trust. He also began, gradually, to open the manor once more to visitors and gatherings, the oppressive silence that had once defined the house giving way slowly to something closer to the life and warmth Doyle remembered from years before the Duchess's death. One crisp morning in early spring, nearly 6 months after the extraordinary events of the 13th, the Duke found Eli in the stables, helping Walter with the morning feeding as had become their comfortable, familiar routine. He watched quietly from the doorway for several minutes before finally stepping inside, and Eli, noticing his presence, straightened immediately with the automatic respect that had become second nature to him over the preceding months. "Your Grace," he said, offering a small, respectful nod. "No need for such formality this morning, Eli," the Duke said, a genuine smile touching his features, one of the increasingly frequent smiles that had become far more common since the difficult months of winter had finally given way to spring. "I simply wished to see how your studies were progressing, and to share a piece of news I thought might interest you." "Of course, Your Grace, my studies are going well. My tutor says I have a particular gift for reasoning through complicated problems, which I suppose isn't entirely surprising given everything that happened last autumn." The Duke's smile widened slightly. "No, I suppose it isn't." He paused, glancing around the familiar stable with an expression of quiet reflection. "I wanted you to know that the trust I established in your name has been finalized, along with formal arrangements for your continued education for as long as you wish to pursue it. Whatever path you eventually choose, whether it leads you toward the law, given your evident skill for uncovering hidden truths, or toward medicine, or toward managing an estate of your own one day, you will have every resource necessary to pursue it fully." Eli felt the same overwhelming gratitude he had experienced months before, though it had settled now into something steadier, less overwhelming, a quiet confidence in the future that had once felt entirely uncertain to a boy who had arrived at Ashcombe Manor with nothing more than his mother's steady hand and a small, worn notebook tucked beneath his shirt. "Thank you, Your Grace. I still don't know that I've properly thanked you for everything you've done for my mother and me." The Duke shook his head slowly. "It is I who remains forever grateful to you, Eli. You saved my life, certainly, but you also gave me something perhaps even more valuable, the truth about my wife's death and the opportunity to finally seek proper justice on her behalf, rather than living out the remainder of my days unknowingly beside her murderer's continued influence over my household and my future. That is a debt no amount of patronage could ever fully repay." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Walter finished the morning's feeding routine, the horses shifting contentedly in their stalls, the pale morning light filtering gently through the stable's high windows. "Your Grace," Eli said finally, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think you'll ever fully heal from everything that happened, from losing the Duchess and then learning the truth of it all these months later?" The Duke considered this question carefully, his gaze drifting toward the window and the gardens beyond, where the first tentative signs of spring had begun to emerge from the frozen ground. "I don't believe grief of that magnitude ever fully disappears, Eli. I suspect I will carry the loss of Alina with me for the remainder of my life, in one form or another. But I have learned, these past months, that grief and healing are not entirely opposed to one another. It is possible, I think, to carry both simultaneously, to honor what has been lost while still allowing yourself to move forward, to find new purpose and new connection in the life that remains." He glanced back toward Eli, his expression warm. "You and your mother, and Walter and his family, and this entire household, have taught me a great deal about that particular balance these past months. For that, I remain endlessly grateful." As the Duke departed the stable a short while later, leaving Eli and Walter to finish their morning duties, Eli found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past 6 months, from a frightened, uncertain arrival at an unfamiliar estate, through weeks of secret investigation and mounting fear, to the terrifying courage required in a single, decisive moment in the courtyard, and finally to the quiet, hard-won peace that had gradually settled over Ashcombe Manor in the aftermath of that terrible, transformative morning. He thought, too, of his father, whose memory had guided him through so much of the fear and uncertainty of those difficult weeks, and he understood now, with a clarity that felt entirely his own, exactly what his mother had meant when she said he carried his father's instinct for noticing what others overlooked, for refusing to leave injustice unaddressed regardless of the personal cost involved. That evening, as he sat with his mother in the small, comfortable room they now shared, considerably more spacious than their original quarters given the Duke's continued generosity toward their circumstances, Eli pulled out the same small notebook that had once held his careful, secret record of the unmarked carriage's comings and goings, the crescent symbol, the dates and times that had eventually unraveled Lord Pembroke's careful, patient scheme. He opened it to a fresh page and began writing, not the careful, fearful observations of a boy uncertain whether anyone would ever believe him, but something entirely different. A simple, grateful record of everything that had changed in the months since that terrible, extraordinary morning. The trial's conclusion, the Duke's gradual healing, Walter's upcoming veterinary training, his own continuing education, and the future that now stretched before him with possibilities he could scarcely have imagined upon first arriving at Ashcombe Manor. Grace watched her son writing quietly beside her, a soft, proud smile touching her features, understanding without needing to ask exactly what he was recording in those careful, familiar pages. "You know," she said gently, "your father would have been so very proud of you, Eli. Not just for your courage that morning, remarkable as it was, but for your patience, your careful observation, your willingness to keep searching for the truth even when everyone around you, myself included, doubted you." Eli looked up from his notebook, meeting his mother's warm gaze. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Mum. Even when you didn't believe me at first, you still raised me to notice things, to care about setting things right. That's what made the difference in the end." Grace pulled him into a gentle embrace, and for a long moment they simply sat together in comfortable, grateful silence, the quiet warmth of their small room a stark and welcome contrast to the fear and uncertainty that had once defined their earliest weeks at Ashcombe Manor. Outside, the estate settled into the peaceful stillness of a spring evening, the manor's windows glowing warmly against the gathering darkness, no longer carrying the oppressive silence of unresolved grief, but something closer to genuine, hard-won peace. The Duke walked the gardens once more that evening, as had become his renewed habit, his steps lighter than they had been in the 2 long years since his wife's death, carrying with him not just the memory of what he had lost, but the profound gratitude of a man who had been given a second chance at life, and that genuine, trustworthy connection, through the extraordinary courage of a housekeeper's young son who had simply refused to let injustice go unanswered. And somewhere in the quiet stables where it had all truly begun, the horses settled into their evening rest, entirely unaware of the extraordinary role they had unknowingly played in a story of betrayal, courage, and ultimately, hard-won justice. A story that would be remembered throughout the estate for many years to come as the moment when a boy's quiet determination to notice what others overlooked had saved not only a duke's life, but an entire household's future.